Is Herodotus' story accurate? No, but that's okay. Not long ago, I finished a short series on the Histories by Herodotus. If you haven't watched it, I encourage you to do so, as in my view, it's one of the easiest ways to understand the full story and all the historical significance of that story and of the book itself at the time that it was written. However, assuming you've now heard the entire story, I want to address a common question about it, which is, how accurate is it? It's something that many people have expressed concern over ever since he completed his work. Thucydides, the author of the History of the Peloponnesian War, who lived less than a century after Herodotus, himself doubts the accuracy of the account, even though he's willing to pick up right where Herodotus left off, more or less. The more I've thought about this question, the more difficult it is to answer directly, and my opinion has changed on the subject even in the course of making this video. Even figuring out what somebody means when they ask whether Herodotus is a reliable source or not can be exhausting. So, because a simple yes or no will completely miss the point of the question, I'm going to try to break it down into some categories that are easier to deal with. So obviously it does not take that long to go into Herodotus and find something he believes about the natural world and the way that it looks that is just inaccurate. Take a look at his map of the world, or the passage in Book 4 where he speaks about the Hyperborean people and all he's heard about them. He even stumbles upon things that are actually true, but that he disbelieves. The Phoenicians set out from the Red Sea and sailed into the sea to the south. It was over 2 years before they rounded the Pillars of Heracles and arrived back in Egypt. They made a claim, which I personally do not believe, that as they were sailing around Libya, they had the sun on their right. If you are aware of the disparity between Herodotus' map and a map of the actual continent of Africa, you'll of course realize that the Phoenicians were telling the truth, and you'll also realize why Herodotus doesn't believe them. You can also look at other accounts he heard about the wildlife of different regions of the world, like the giant ants, which I discussed in the series, or the flying snakes. But that isn't usually what people mean when they question Herodotus' authenticity. Further, if a person did earnestly hold mistaken beliefs about the natural world due to a lack of scientific evidence available at the time, that would not necessarily make him a liar or even just unreliable or mistaken in other areas. The core of the question, I suspect, is more so if the people really said what they said and really did what they did as represented in the story. Let's take a look. Just as I did during the series, I must consult Dewald's brilliant introduction to my copy that addresses various aspects of this issue. You can find this if you have the Oxford World Classics copy of Herodotus. Dewald identifies our custom as modern readers to expect historians to critique their stories and analyze them in a certain way. Herodotus frequently offers his critical analysis of the information that he presents, but not in the way we would expect, which can definitely throw some people off. Dewald writes, "The longer, more polished stories certainly retell past events, both Greek and barbarian, but they do so with much included that is not today customarily found in historical narrative. Conversations from foreign lands in the distant past are recounted that neither Herodotus nor his informants probably knew about. Motives are described, stories are told from the imagined points of view of their actors, vivid details are supplied that are almost certainly the product of someone's invention rather than of actual memory. Most of this would have seemed natural both to Herodotus' 5th century interlocutors and his audiences, as the normal way to hear about things from the past. But to us, such narrative practices seem suspect." Dewald points out that the reason they would find this natural is, of course, because that's exactly what Homer did. That's what they're used to. This is one more reason that others have said, and I agree, that the Histories is a book written in the epic mode, even if it's not technically an epic. Getting back to the dialogue that's included, though, Thucydides actually explains a version of Herodotus' practice in his History of the Peloponnesian War. With reference to the speeches in this history, some were delivered before the war began, others while it was going on. Some I heard myself, others I got from various quarters. It was in all cases difficult to carry them word for word in one's memory, so my habit has been to make the speakers say what was, in my opinion, demanded of them by the various occasions, of course adhering as closely as possible to the general sense of what they really said. Herodotus seems to do something similar in his work. After all, how do we know what Queen Atossa said to King Darius in their bedchamber? that got him to invade Greece? Who could possibly be privy to that level of information besides the king and queen themselves? Who could Herodotus have been talking to? I think Herodotus' dialogue goes even a little further than that, though. I think he seems to include information and lines of dialogue that his speakers would know and be aware of that does not need to be said for their audience, but it does have to be said for the sake of Herodotus' audience. You can easily see this in Mardonius' urging Xerxes to invade Greece at the Council of War in Book 7. Particularly important was your promise not to let those despicable Ionians, the ones living in Europe, get away with making fools of us. We conquered the Sakai, the Indians, the Ethiopians, the Assyrians, and plenty of other important races, and now we hold them in slavery. Why? Not because they did us any wrong, but just because we wanted to increase our dominion. Among people who were already aware of the Persian Empire's history and their reason for invading, and where the Ionians lived, that could be said in less than one sentence. But, for the sake of Herodotus' readers, he has Mardonius restate the entire thing. That's my guess, anyway. Remember, though, that he does provide evidence for some of the longer speeches. In Book 3, Darius and his co-conspirators argue over what sort of government they should have, and one of them argues for democracy. Herodotus expects his Greek readers to disbelieve this, so he highlights a similar instance later on, when Mardonius himself institutes democracies in Ionia in order to keep the peace for Darius. So while some of the dialogue is literary invention entirely, and some of it is there for exposition purposes, we can also suppose that some of it, even including perhaps parts of the great speeches, are quite closely paraphrased. In my view, the dialogue being suspect at times is not a problem. If what Dewald is telling us is true, then not even the Greek listeners at the time of Herodotus took the lines of dialogue too seriously, and probably understood them in a manner similar to how Thucydides explains it for us. For them, this was not evidence that the whole work or the events were fabricated, and so in good faith, I think that it shouldn't be for us either. So is every event included by Herodotus in his histories true? No. Remember that he includes some folk tales and mythology in his story, especially when describing the origins of peoples that he writes about. Was Scythia really founded by the unions of the mythical Amazonian women? Or was the demigod Hercules more or less a real person who traveled there to become the father of their progenitors? Probably not. Herodotus even straddles this line between history and mythology when talking about his theories regarding the Trojan War being a huge misunderstanding, with Helen and her treasures really in Egypt the whole time. You can take those theories about the Trojan War as seriously or unseriously as you'd like. But again, that's not what people actually care about, I think, when they're asking about his accuracy. They want to know about the Persian Wars themselves. Did that actually happen, and how did it happen? It depends partially on how much you trust Herodotus. Dewald asks, could a narrative, repeatedly and deeply striking the note of the painful importance of accurate information, also be making up most of the data that it deploys? If so, the histories are an even more consummately brilliant perversity than Herodotus' modern critics claim. This expresses the chief difficulty in doubting Herodotus' truthfulness. He's a scientist in a way, and he already doubts himself as a result. He emphasizes that what he's gathered from his sources is provisional information. As data, they are only as good as the quality of his sources allows. He clearly understands the limits of what he represents to us. My series does not really show all of the times that he does this for the sake of the cohesive narrative, but Dewald is right. He does it a lot, almost every page. With that being said, let's look at what events can be corroborated from other sources and what is directly told to us only by Herodotus. The line of kings of Persia, we know that from other sources. They're part of various Achaemenid royal inscriptions. The manner of the deaths of Cyrus and Cambyses varies from source to source. For Cyrus, battles are usually mentioned. Tomyris is sometimes mentioned. For Cambyses, complications for an accidental wound are almost always mentioned. The empire's acquisition of lands is widely accepted today, and would have been confirmed in one way or another through archaeology. The first invasion of Greece and the Battle of Marathon. Nobody else from the same time records this, but just Herodotus. Although the victory monuments are real, so something happened there for sure. How about the second invasion of Greece, with Thermopylae, Artemisium, Salamis, and Plataea? Only Herodotus' account speaks about any of these that's so close to the time, with one exception that I'll get into later. There's archaeological evidence that confirms aspects of Herodotus' story, but no other alternate narratives survive. Plenty of people today doubt the size of the army that Xerxes brought to Greece, which Herodotus tells us was supposed to be 5.4 million people. Herodotus even tells his hearers how the army was counted. 10,000 men were assembled in a single area and packed as closely together as possible. A circle was drawn round the outside of the body of men, who were then dismissed, and a waist-high wall was built around the circle. Then more men were introduced into the enclosed area, and so on until everyone had been counted. Despite this, he is doubted by modern historians, supposedly. Although I'll tell you, it was interesting to try to find anybody who denied this number with any kind of evidence. Admittedly, from a quick Google search, the majority of people who critically looked at this number were just on online forums. Almost exclusively, actually. Users vaguely referenced modern historians who seem to estimate Xerxes' forces to be no more than 100,000, or 50,000, or maybe even 30,000. And let's say that I take their word for it, and that there are some modern historians that say this. Well, what reasons were given for this? Well, all they did was cite the sheer impossibility of any nation being able to handle the logistics and supply lines for such a large force as 5.4 million. Sounds reasonable, and yet, it's not. This is not evidence. This is just a fancy way of saying, it's too hard, therefore it's impossible. I think it may also be based on a rather boastful presumption that maybe you've encountered as well. It goes something like this. The nations of my world today are surely the most capable that have ever existed. If something is impossible for them, then it's impossible for every other nation in history as well. The one scholarly article I actually found on the subject that was not simply summarizing Herodotus' claims was from John Scott, writing in the Classical Journal in 1915. I encourage you to read the whole article, which was entitled Thoughts on the Reliability of Classical Writers, with a special reference to the size of the army of Xerxes. It's only a few pages long, and I'll link it below. Scott offers plenty of evidence that actually supports Herodotus' claim. He reminds his readers, as well as many of the critical scholars that were writing in his day, of a number of things that they probably forgot and should have remembered. Aeschylus, who actually fought in the Persian Wars, reports the exact same numbers as Herodotus. Herodotus' account explains how such a large army was supplied. It took years to gather them all, to plan the route, and to pre-supply the route with provisions. Many of the soldiers brought their own arms as well. Scott points out that in World War I, in his day, nobody was second-guessing the far larger numbers of soldiers that were being deployed either. Finally, he identifies a number of sentences in Aeschylus in his writings that all indicate that the Persian Empire was completely drained of men and resources in the years, maybe even decades, following the second invasion of Greece. This is corroborated by the fact that they ceased to be able to defend their outer territories at the exact same time. Could the loss of only 30,000 men do that? Or even 100,000? Definitely not. In summary, I believe the size of the army, though I would grant that it's probably only ever supposed to be an approximation. Lastly, perhaps you think that surely Herodotus wrote with a pro-Greek bias. He probably made the Persians appear much more evil than they actually were, and made the Greeks seem better than they actually were. I try to counter this in my series. I show the times that Herodotus shows that the Greeks are making bad decisions on numerous occasions. If you're still not convinced, though, the historian Tom Holland writes in his book, Persian Fire, about an indignant Greek patriot that heard Herodotus' works and called him a barbarian lover on account of his treatment of the Persians. The exact same phrase appears in an essay by Plutarch on the malice of Herodotus, in which he is so pro-barbarian as to absolve Persians and other non-Greeks of plenty of blame while attacking the Greeks and blaming them for their actions in other places. This suggests to me that perhaps, to the Persians, he's being more than fair. I'll link that essay below too. And besides, as was already mentioned, Herodotus grew up in Halicarnassus. They were on the Persian side, if you remember. Artemisia was the queen of Halicarnassus that joined Xerxes, which means Herodotus grew up as a Persian subject. The culture was pretty Hellenized, and I'm sure he had plenty of dealings with Greeks all the time, but also Persians. There's not enough to just unilaterally assume that he was pro-Greek to the exclusion of saying anything good about the Persians, when the Greeks were blaming him for saying good things about the Persians. In summary, there are plenty of things that Herodotus got wrong, but there's also much that he got right. And as far as I can tell, it's the most important parts that were right.